Hi, it's February 1st, and we got a quick office update here. There was no meeting this week. Next week on February 8th, that's Wednesday, we have Realtor.com come in to do a quick overview of the program. So next Wednesday, 10 a.m., we have Realtor.com coming in. What we're going to talk about today, though, is pretty much agency. I do get this question quite a bit. Say that you're working with a seller that's getting ready to list their house, but they find their own buyer. The question is what type of agent should I be and how much can I charge? So first let's take a look at the different types of agencies that we offer. First would be a buyer agent, where all your duties and your fiduciary duty is to the buyer. The second would be the seller, where you owe your duties to the seller. The next one would be a dual agent, where you're actually representing both parties. And to me, that's the worst type of agency that we could be, because what you're doing is you're opening yourself up to liability from both parties. So I never really recommend that we do any type of dual agent. The only time you would be a dual agent is if you had a listing and you had to have the buyer. Typically, you would do a seller's agent with that scenario and tell the buyer that you're really representing the seller. But sometimes they balk at that, and you would have to do a dual agent where you're actually representing both parties. The next one is a transaction coordinator. That's where you pretty much represent no one, and all you're doing is processing the papers and putting the transaction together. So those are the four types of agency. It's buyer, seller, dual, or transaction. Under the scenario where someone finds a buyer for their home, I would either represent the person that called me. So let's say if a buyer was out looking and they found a home that they wanted you to approach, I would represent the buyer. But if a seller calls you up and says, hey, I found a buyer for my property, then I would represent the seller. Transaction coordinator would probably be my next option, to where I basically tell both parties that I'm not really representing anyone. All I'm doing is really working on processing the paperwork and making sure you guys have a successful closing. So again, dual agency, I typically would not try to ever do a dual agent, because you have a liability from both buyer and seller. The next thing is how much can you charge for that? Well, the office really has a minimum commission rate of the $2,000. So anything above that is negotiable. Typically what I would do is probably charge 3%. Figure that the buyer or the buyer or the seller, whoever found the property, pretty much is working as the other agent, and all I'm going to do is process the paperwork and take 3%. The next thing is when you do something like this, you're basically doing both sides of the deal anyway, so be prepared to do twice as much work as you would on a typical deal, because you are then now actually doing work for both buyer and seller. So if you have a seller that found their own buyer, you're still going to research the lender, still going to track the mortgage with the lender, and still do all the things with the seller. So hopefully that answered some questions. Again, agency. Now, when you're doing agency, and anytime you do any type of paperwork, like say a listing agreement or a purchase agreement, just remember there's three types of agency forms that are required. One is either, like on the buyer side, it'd be the exclusive right, the exclusive buyer agency. Then you have the state form, which is the buyer agency agreement, which is a 3-page state form, and then you have the addendum to the buyer agent form. The reason that we have the addendums is because we are a designated agency office. What that means is that you're only representing the client that you have. Under the old type of agency, before designated agent, if we had a buyer or a listing, let's say if we had a listing, basically what would happen is everybody that worked in this office would now be a dual agent if they found a buyer, because basically we had an agency relationship with the seller, and now we have our agency relationship with the buyer. So that takes dual agency out of the office, and the only time you'd have a dual agent is when it's your listing. So again, there's three forms for either side. On the listing side, you're going to have the exclusive right to sell, the buyer agents or the buyer agency form from the state, and then the addendum. Buy side, you're going to have the buyer agency agreement, the agency disclosure form, and the addendum. List side, I think I was wrong before. You don't need a buyer agency. What you need is you need the agency disclosure. So either one, agency disclosure, addendum, and your contract, your agreement to get paid. Thanks. Have a great week.